good, it's full. Good afternoon. I'm Philippe Vergne. I'm the director of MOCA. Thank you for coming this afternoon for this conversation around Matthew Barney's River of Fundament. I hope you all have seen the exhibition by now. It's quite extraordinary. It's a story of birth, reincarnation, inspired by Norman Mailer, almost Norman Rockwell. Norman Mailer, sorry, Matthew. Norman Mailer, last novel, Ancient Evening. And it's also a very incredible sculptural experimentation in which objects are cast out of iron, steel, zinc, bronze, as well as out of literature, narrative, and history. It was a significant effort for the museum, so the exhibition would not have happened without a very specific alchemy of support. And I want to thank the Lawrence Foundation in Basel. I want to thank Steve Cohen in New York. I want to thank Mark Fletcher and Tobias Meyer for their support, Pam and Dick Kramlik for their support, Mitch and Emily Rails for making this exhibition possible. We are all indebted to the people who work with Matthew on an everyday basis, Barbara Gladstone Gallery, Sadie Cole's Gallery, and here in Los Angeles, Reagan Project. And I hope you also all have seen the exhibition on view at Reagan Project right now. It's also a Matthew Barney exhibition, which is a true complement from the exhibition we have here at MOCA. It's a great honor today to have here for a conversation Professor Homi Bhabha with Matthew Barney. Professor Bhabha is the Anne Rothenberg Professor of English and American Literature and the Director of the Humanities at Harvard Universities. His work over many years has been a contemplation of postcolonial theory, cultural change, power, human rights in the context of aesthetic and culture. Among his many books, The Location of Culture, personally for me, has been almost a roadmap, a guide to actually think a little bit more broadly about what we do as a cultural institution. Many of us in the field, I looked at his work as a way to expand our understanding of modernity, make modernity a plural, a modernity that goes way beyond Europe and America. Actually, I think that if Professor Bhabha would have a dime every time a curator or an art historian would have quoted and often maybe misquoted his work, he would be in a position to support the institution. Matthew Barney, well, I think you all know that in the early 90s, Matthew has changed our understanding of sculpture, of narrative, of performance by actually bringing all these different practices together. His work is a true contemplation, a profound contemplation of our contemporary condition, of our history. So it's with great pleasure that we are welcoming them. Before I give them the floor, I would like to read you a few lines from the essay that Professor Bhabha wrote for Matthew's River of Fundament publication. Barney is particularly interested in turning time, be it the temporality of history or the durational experience of the performance, into a sculptural object. Narrative sculpture appeals to material memory and the sculptural practices of the past, in order to visualize objects and projects that initiate dialogues with new materials and establish new sites and systems of art making. Please join me in welcoming Professor Bhabha and Matthew Barney to this stage. Thank you.
Philippe, thank you very much for that beautifully placed and situated introduction for both of us and to this event, and congratulations to all of you here for the remarkable show. We must mention Lenka Tattershall, who has been extraordinarily helpful in every way. Helen Molesworth is a dear friend and colleague from Harvard who I miss more than she knows, and I'm saying this without being able to see her here, so this is no flattery at all. Helen, nice to hear you. I'd also like to thank Alison Spellacy, who in our conversations has always been present in the most enabling way, and Sean Reagan for throwing some of her magic dust at us over this weekend. So thank you all very much. Matthew, thank you for being here. And I'm just going to talk like we talk in the studio. I'm not intimidated by these people. We'll just talk as we talk in the studio. And in fact, my first question to you comes from a sense when I walked into the show that the experimental work that happens in your studio, the studio is a space for thinking and rethinking and asking more questions, was beautifully brought in to the museum space here. And that sort of makes me think that very often we don't see the museum in the studio and the studio in the museum. You know, you can take the art out of the museum to display it, out of the studio to display it, but the experimental spirit of the studio remains in the work wherever it goes. And my first question is actually around this issue. The idea that, as you put it to me once in our conversation, that the great power of the studio, and I'm talking about the studio here not only as a space, but as a way of thinking, a way of working, an openness of ongoing practice, that the great power of the studio was that it allowed you to think about art as a subliming vessel. And you said something to me like, a subliming vessel is a fascinating model for object making, where things are placed together side by side, as if a form of alchemy could happen and a material transformation could take place. And I began to think of that not only as a statement from you about making the object of art, and I'd be interested if you could take that metaphor and just open it up for us a bit, but the making of a show must also be like a subliming vessel. You put things side by side, different scales, you know, the drawings in opposite these great large sculptural works, a real disjunction of scale. And that must also create its alchemy. So would you talk about the subliming vessel as a way of thinking about the art object, but also the display of the object in the museum?
Well, probably helpful to start by saying what a subliming vessel is. It takes a solid and it transforms a solid into gas, or it brings gas, distills gas from the solid, and it skips the liquid state. So there's a way in which the art making process for me is like that. That there's a there's a way of looking at it on one hand in a linear way, in a logical way, that you make certain moves and you get from point A to point B, but it doesn't really work that way. You know, that there's you get from point A to C and you skip B somehow. And I think that 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 it's true, the two models you're speaking of, one is the way things function in the studio, and experiments take place over a great deal of time, and things lay around, and they're allowed to change on their own terms, or they're allowed to make certain demands themselves. And I and we as a kind of collaborative group working on this project have to respond to those needs. That there's a synergy that forms, which is greater than the sum of the parts. And I think when the work is then brought from the studio into the exhibition space, that that becomes formalized as an installation strategy, or a conversation is made by really thinking about the spaces between things, and how relationships can be made between the objects in the space. And I found the space at MOCA especially sympathetic to that. And I think it's a number of reasons. One might be quite literal, that it does feel like a working environment. But I think the one that was more surprising to me is the presence of the sun. That there's daylight in there that really illuminated the space between things, and got it away from that sort of clinical, sort of spotlit, discrete object, or this sort of autonomy that sculpture is always given in exhibition spaces. So I was, when I install in spaces like that, I tend to use lighting that's non-directional and try to light the space rather than the object, so that kind of space between things can be as pregnant as the object itself. And here it's in the space already, and in that way it was very sympathetic.
I was thinking about the moment when I saw the sacrificial pig in the studio as it was festering. You remember the foul odors and the process and all the fungus and all that mold. And then I saw it back again here in the show, just the skeletal remains. And exactly what you said happened to me, that within the studio, it already was making its relations with the other moments in the film, and its own use within the film, and the way it's said. Here, it had a very different presence in relation to the other forms of casting, the other materials that were around it. So I think this idea that the museum, that the meaning is in the relation, and you made it very concrete by talking about the way you liked in order to emphasize the relationality. Very interestingly, also questions this notion of the autonomy of the work. But exploring as you do relationships takes me to another issue that we talked about, I tried to write about, but I haven't written about, but would like to explore further with you, which is your concept of narrative sculpture. That even the spaces in between is where the narrative takes place. And of course, when we think of narrative, particularly in this phase of work, we think about, when we think about narrative, and we think about the idea of the subliming vessel, subliming, we think about the great mythologies your work is, these transformative moments that you have culled out of Mela, the notion of ancient evening, the myth of Osiris, the Book of the Dead, you know, these great narratives that are being worked right through the show. So that makes me want to ask you about your statement to me once. The intention has always been to make narrative sculpture. And today, by illuminating the spaces in between works, whether in the studio or outside, I begin to understand how the notion of transformation, which is most obviously illustrated by your use of, or your interest in mythology, is something very deeply rooted in the work itself. It's not simply that, it's not that you get the mailer idea and then illustrate, but the idea of mythology and transformation is very much a part of the very materials you use. So I was just interested in exploring with you this notion of narrative sculpture, particularly since we talked about the relational reality of work.
Well, to speak about it in terms of Ancient Evenings or River of Fundament is, I think, you know, we can be more literal about it in the way that the kind of organizing text was a novel in this case, and that from that novel, video work was made, a piece of moving image, a narrative was made, and from that narrative, these objects are made. And the objects, I think, are often to do with these relationships. They're like critical relationships within the story. You know, relationships that might not have the kind of resolve that you expect from cinema. You know, either a kind of stunted sense of character development or an unresolved relationship. And so I think in my mind that always gives space for the object to exist, to create that kind of resolve, or to occupy that space that's vacant in the film. But I think I feel like a more clear answer could come from the works that came before that, you know, dealt more directly with the body and how, you know, for example, Drawing Restraint 9, which was made in Japan, and dealt largely with the body of the whale, or the capturing and processing of the whale on the Japanese whaling ship, and how that the protagonist is something like a guest in a host body, the host body of the Japanese whaling ship, and so there's a number of these kind of guest and host relationships in that piece that I think have to do with my relationship to narrative. That the narrative is a host body, and I am a guest to that narrative, and so my language has to pass through this narrative in order to give it form, which is really what I need to do as an artist to create form, and I somehow cannot do that without this organizing body, and so the narratives change, and they're borrowed. Sometimes they exist in the world. Sometimes I try to write them, but it always starts with a narrative as a way of distilling these forms, which you know, I think have varying degrees of autonomy from the narrative. But you know, I think I'm interested in that range.
And Matthew, in that sense, if we take a written narrative, like for instance Ancient Evenings, just to return to it because it's so much around us at the moment, that's the host, as it were, and you enter there as you say, as a guest, as an agent. And you make a film of it, and a film which has not only a visual, which refers to the written language, the text, because there's a lot of recitation in the film. And then there is a visual language that you develop, which is a cinematic visual language. And then there is a sculptural language. There are works that are made that become part of the language of the film, but are not simply, but are more sculptural rather than simply cinematic. They're not sequential, they become more symbolic, they become more iconic in some way. They become metaphors, but made metaphors, sculptural metaphors. So this again, is it not another form of the notion of subliming? And when you do that, at what point do these the sculptures which are the guests in the larger whole, how are they removed? How do they have an identity outside of the narrative? How do they come to stand for something that obviously refers to the narrative, but then has its own presence?
Well, I think that's the range that I'm talking about. I think that there, in this exhibition here, there are examples, a number of examples that on one hand you have a piece that was cast directly within the action of the performed scene, and in that way that piece is more of a fact. It happened and was witnessed by a group of people within that action, and that has a very different meaning than the Boat of Ra piece, for example, which is a construction, and it's a reconstruction of the home of Norman Mailer and some of the contents from his house, and it's abstracted from a form within the film, but it wasn't literally used in the film, although there are certain pieces that have been used and then they're changed. So I think there's a number of different ways in which objects are pulled from the narrative, and I think they operate very differently, but they're all interesting to me. And I think one of the things that River of Fundament has done, which is different from, for example, the Cremaster cycle, is that it has changed the ratio between what is real and what is artificial in the work, and I think that happened by staging these scenes live. That was a way of rewiring it.
Like the wig scene.
Which is more of a construction. It was performed for the camera, although there's a lot of improvisation in that scene, and kind of real-time performance in it, but it was a film set. I'm thinking more of the scenes in Detroit, which were performed over the course of a day with a group of 300 people watching, and so the running camera was really just documenting what happened. They're very different in that way, and so I think that kind of balance that existed in the Cremaster cycle was really tipped toward artificiality, and I think with River of Fundament it really tipped the other way, toward the real and toward the actual.
But that's really interesting, because in that Detroit scene where the car is submerged and then emerged, so there you have, as you put it, the home of Norman Mailer is a particular set. Then you have the more ritual moment in Detroit, And then the object that emerges, which is a kind of protagonist itself, like the body of Osiris, you know, the unearthing of the car, the Chrysler Imperial. So there are three different interesting moments there, where there's the creation of an object, the creation of a scene, and the creation of a setting. Is that right? I mean, am I getting it?
Well, I think it happens both in the filmmaking and in the object making. So I think we could speak about it in both realms.
So let's do that.
Uh-huh.
So I'm thinking that maybe we should talk a little bit about two notions of casting in your work as a way of getting at this problem, and then we should look at some works and just have you talk about these two processes. So one, let's talk about casting, is really the making of the object. You know, your interest in graphite and sulfur and bronze and water casting, you know, really the casting. And the casting, of course, also goes back to your use of petroleum jelly, you know, and the drawing restraint series too. So there's a lot of casting as to make an object. We'll see some of it. And then casting in the more, if I might put it, in the more metaphorical but filmic sense of the casting to make characters, to make mise en scène, to make narratives. So the casting on the one side is to make the object, and the casting on the other is to make the narrative. And maybe here we get some purchase on this notion of narrative sculpture. And I would like, but it seems to me that there's always the intersection in your work of the two notions of casting. The process that makes the object ghosts the object, it haunts the object, even when that process isn't there. You know, that the history of the object is in the very process. You can see the marks literally on the body of the work of the casting process. And then there is the second, more metaphorical notion of the way in which that object becomes cast in a larger narrative. And I think that's something that is so remarkable about the use of time and technology, material and meaning, that I think we should perhaps share with our friends here some such moments where we see both forms of casting, and just have you talk about them in each case, and along this particular axis, this particular intersection. So if we could have these, the first. Yeah. So
Yeah. Okay. So this piece called Jed is cast iron, and it was cast. I was speaking of it a moment ago. It was cast in a performance in Detroit, and that casting was made before an audience, and what you're seeing here is three elements from a casting system that was more or less like a medieval casting system where the metal is poured directly into the ground. On the right here you have a reservoir of metal that was filled first and then irrigated down through these two rivers into a lower chamber. And in that lower chamber, there was an impression in the ground of the undercarriage of a Chrysler Imperial. And then beyond that object, you see a smaller reservoir, which was the overflow from that casting process. Maybe we should look at the next slide. So there's that facility, and it was made. It was made in the same way that a backyard furnace is constructed, where you top load the coke, the limestone, and fragments of iron, and you keep melting bits of iron and loading more coke, more limestone, more iron, all from the top. So you had all of these workers at the top loading iron, into the top, including the Chrysler Imperial, which was dredged from the river and then cut into 14 pieces. It was fed into the top of the furnaces. So the body of that protagonist was then melted and cast into this lower chamber. And it was around this time I became aware of these archaeological digs in Scandinavia, where they found evidence that near these medieval furnaces there were the remains of humans, and that they were taking the bones of humans and putting them into the furnace. And I think it had to do with two things. That one, the fat from the body was making the fire burn hotter, and so they learned that the hotter the fire, the harder the metal. So they were, in a way, starting to move toward making carbon steel, rather than straightforward iron, without really understanding that technology. But I think they were also choosing the bones of great warriors to invest into the fire, to bring the spirit of the great warrior into the blade they were casting. And so I think there was something clicked for me when I learned about this so-called bone coal casting, that in terms of what we were trying to achieve in this performance, and the kind of directness of the casting that I wanted. And so in that way, I think that sculpture jet is really unusually direct for something I've made, while still holding on to the narrative.
So really the idea of the body, or the spirit of the body, the human body, as made part of, and the narrative of heroism as actually made into the object, cast in the steel itself, is a very powerful way of thinking, because it gets rid of a notion of the image or the symbol as something imposed upon material. It's really thinking about that whole symbolic area from within the material. And then, with your interest in the myth of Osiris and the dismembering of Osiris's body into 14 parts, and in your allegory, the Chrysler Imperial plays that role in a way. So the complexity here is both hugely clarifying and very original and unusual in the coming together of what is heroic and what is material, what is the body and what is matter. And this is why I think those two notions of casting come so close for you, that the symbolic notion of casting in the body and narrative is actually in the material itself. And I think, as you've described it, that's a very rare insight into the making of work. And I think we should move to the next one and see where we get with that.
So these pieces, called water castings, I've been working on them just in the last year. And these started with the notion of having made that work in Detroit, which took place in the rain, and not just rain, but like a downpour. And there was a lot of concern for the safety of the audience, that that when you introduce moisture to molten metal, the water expands beneath the heat of the metal, and it pushes the metal back out. So it explodes effectively. And so we were concerned that the metal would be thrown back at the audience, and the audience was then we tried to remove them from the situation, which was difficult to do. But in my mind, I immediately started thinking about making castings into water and what that would do on a larger scale if a lot of metal was poured into a river, for example. And so we started in the studio experimenting on a very small scale with molten zinc, which we could melt ourselves and pour into 5-gallon drums of water, into 55-gallon drums of water, added more metal. And as we increased the volume, we learned that the surface tension of the water was not enough to slow down the metal. And so slowly we started adding different thickening agents to the water. We tried clay, we tried waxes, we tried pizza dough, we tried all kinds of things to slow the metal down. And at that point I had to give up on this idea of this more direct approach of pouring metal directly into the river. But this was the starting point in terms of its relationship back to the narrative and the flooding of the Nile into its banks every year, and the tears of Isis falling into the river and causing the river to flood. So eventually we started working with a foundry in Washington State, the Walla Walla Foundry, and asked them to perform the same experiments we were performing in the studio with bronze. And slowly we worked our way toward about a ton of bronze. Next slide would probably be good. So they had, in their facility, in the casting room, they excavated a pit in the floor and then put this steel sheathing around the pit. And in that pit mixed water and a clay called bentonite, and made a kind of a slurry that was both liquid and had more solid chunks of clay in it. And so we started using that pit to cast these pieces. And what would happen is that the metal would go down into the mixture. It would react with the moisture. The moisture would expand into steam and explode the metal apart, and it would force the metal into the spaces between those chunks of clay. And so the pieces really have the memory of those spaces, but it also has that reaction as a form. And in certain cases, I was able to push an object down into the clay and create a space for the metal to penetrate deeper into the pit. And when that would happen, the gases would build up and the metal would then explode out, and these hollow columns were left behind. So this is in the middle of one of these explosions. And next slide. So that form there is, for example, one of these columns. What you see in the foreground is the lines left behind by pulling a circular object back out of the clay, and it raked the clay and left those ridges.
So, again, something that interests me is the fact that, as you say, this process is a very physical process. It's a very performative process. And at the same time, it carries with it that, as you said a moment ago, that larger narrative, the flooding of the banks, what comes out of the Nile, sometimes, even the serpent of the Nile, the phallic nature of what emerges from the Nile, the tears that fall into it. But this raises a further question, having seen the intersection of the forms of casting, casting for narrative or casting for of the object. The further question is the idea of ritual in art, because each of these moments, whether or not they are in the film and recording, are kind of moments of public art, moments of, although they may be done privately, they're moments of art as ritual, as dealing with nature and culture and symbol and myth. When you're actually making these works, is that narrative in your mind? That these are themselves ceremonies of art, ritual ceremonies of art. The creative process is being done industrially or whatever, but it's being done in a very tangible, rich, communal way.
No, I think these pieces are a really good example of a more clandestine version of that, where there's a very specific choreography that was designed within the foundry, within the casting room, to make these, and that it involved, 8 or 10 workers who, are normally, casting any given bronze object in many parts, sending it off to the welding room where they're welded together, sending that off to the finishing room where the welds are chased out. So there's a kind of an assembly line nature to the casting arts or the foundry arts that doesn't exist in these pieces at all. Like, these pieces are their events, they're performances, and I think that, like, watching the guys in the casting room put on their protective equipment and put on a game face and sort of know the level of danger, when you mix moisture and molten metal, that they have to be focused, and that choreography day after day became more and more specific and specialized, and it wasn't witnessed, it was, but it went, that energy went into the object.
That's my point.
Mhm.
That's why you call it clandestine.
Mm-hmm.
But also this other aspect of it is that in the material you find a kind of memory.
Mm-hmm.
Like in ritual, in the act you find a memory.
Mhm.
Here in the material you find a memory of that substance itself, that material itself, and the
Mhm.
process, but also the larger
Mm-hmm.
cultural ritual of making
Mm-hmm.
these objects, which are then thought of as art. But the whole performance is what interests me.
Yeah. I think the other word is behavior. That there's that materials have a behavior, and a material process has its own behavior. And when that becomes a kind of a collective effort, each of those individuals has a behavior. So all of those things go into the piece. And for sure, I'm interested in that. I think it's one of the things that keeps me involved in filmmaking. Is the scale of that kind of collective behavior, that you can't control it, and it's in the same way that you can't really control these pieces, but everybody can react to that behavior in a subtle way, and that really creates the spirit of the piece.
So let me then stray away from this for a minute and ask you whether that sense of protectiveness, the sense of choreography that you've talked about, the performance, the sense of danger, the sense of working together, and yet each person having a sense of its strategy for themselves to, how does this relate to your great interest in sport?
Well, it's very similar. It's I think one of the things that I really took from athletics is the this sort of notion of the field, that within the field there's a specific set of rules and a code. You know, there's a kind of an understood code of ethics. There's a, you know, there's an entire world within that field, and once that can be accepted, anything goes. You know, or people will push themselves, as you know, beyond what they're capable of doing, and you know, I think each one of these projects is like that for me. You know, that there's on the front end a lot of effort into describing what the field is going to be and what the set of rules is going to be, and then all hell breaks loose. You know, anything can happen once the frame is established, and yeah, I think that came from sports, like being involved in that when I was younger.
I think that's a great segue to the next moment, the graphite block that we have here, because there you see the aspect of sport and the making of the work in this latest body restraint work. So maybe you could talk about this and then we'll...
Yeah, okay, so in the foreground we have what's called portcullis block, and that's a 5,000-pound block of graphite. In the background you have the boat of Ra, which is a reconstruction of the top floor of Norman Mailer's brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, and it's inverted as if a ship in a shipyard. Inside the house there's a mold. It's made of resin bonded sand, which is how a typical sand mold would be made for metal casting. And inside this sand mold is a bronze desk, the desk of the writer, and the proportions of that sand mold are to the proportions of the room that Norman Mailer built at the top of his house, where he would climb ladders and go across these boardwalks to get to this writing room that he had made for himself, a kind of crow's nest in the top of his house. And so in the boat of Ra, it's organized something like a burial chamber, where the body of the deceased would be led down a tunnel, and once it's in the chamber, a block would be put into the tunnel so that the tomb couldn't be raided. And so in that way, this block of graphite is made to the same proportion of that tunnel down into the burial chamber. Next image. So this is a drawing restraint that we performed here together with a local team, a football team called the LA Temptation, and they're a football team, and they were asked to drag the block around the perimeter of the exhibition and use the block as a drawing tool and leave a line around the perimeter of the show. Yeah. So
all the way around.
So the block was designed so that it had a tip which would enable them to leave a straight single line, but if they steered the block off of the kind of perpendicular axis, it would leave a fatter line or a double line. And so the team captain was given the direction that she could create that drawing herself. She could make those decisions, and she would have to direct her team in order to do that, to speed up the movement of the block, or to sway the axis of the block. Yeah, I think this is a good example of the drawing restraints that sometimes involve my own body and sometimes don't. In this case, it didn't.
And it's part of the gaming of this too, that they've got all these pressures. You put enormous pressure and resistance, as indeed the graphite block does, in order to make a line, which marks out a certain field, to use the language you were talking about, and it has its own rules. But while marking out the field on the wall of the museum, there's also a reference to drawing, literally to drawing, and the show has some remarkable drawings of a different kind. And then the drawing, so I'm just trying to track these various perspectives, these various moments, and then the drawing, when the pieces come to an end, and they install, so to speak, the graphite block, it becomes a sculptural object. So there's this amazing notion of the field, the field and the sports-like strategy, the tension of drawing, the embodied nature of making the line, and then the work being grounded like a sculptural work. And so it's extraordinarily, again, extraordinarily explores the spaces in between various kinds of practices, various kinds of art practices. The relations between drawing, sculpture, the notion of a field of meaning. And this moment, there's a wonderful video of the whole process, which I'm sure many of you have seen, but those of you who haven't should really see it. It's a remarkable video. This, I think, takes us to the last section of our session, which is about film. Because it already introduces the sculpture in a narrative. So to go back to your notion of narrative sculpture. And the question I think I want to pose to you after we watch the film is this, that just as you have rather fully explored with us this notion of narrative sculpture, is there a way in which the lessons of sculpture help us to think about film narrative? The making of the sculpture helps us to think about film narrative, just like narrative gives us a casting for the object itself. So I think maybe we should watch the film and then open up to that question. And I have one more question about sports and sex, which is the ideal way to wrap this up. So don't leave before the sport and sex question comes in. Right? Let's show the film. think I'm going to let that stand, the film, as really as a sort of concluding moment around what we've explored around narrative, object making, casting in both the senses, casting as narrative and casting as object making. Because in a way it brought it all together, I thought, rather beautifully. In the light of our conversation, you could literally see the making of objects and the making of narrative work together right the way through. But there is one aspect. So I think that we can leave that open for questions unless you want to say something about that. You know, the reversal of your earlier notion as narrative sculpture, and now talk about film narrative sculpture, but we can leave that open. But there is something that had a volume to it, almost a sculptural volume, and that was the music. And I wondered whether you might say something about that. It really had a huge weight, almost a ballast, you know, almost like an installational kind of presence, which was also relational right through the film. And I wanted to say something about that if you can, and then I want to talk about sex and sport. Very quickly.
Well, I mean, first of all, the film River of Fundament is a collaboration with Jonathan Bepler, who I've worked with for many years now, and we had discussed the possibility of making an opera, over the years, and I think this project grew out of that conversation of how we might develop an entire work together that would, where music would be an integral part of the piece and a dominant character or a significant character in it, and so we started by, considering the stage and then deciding that didn't feel right, and then moving back into these sort of site-specific locations as a way of creating a context for this piece, but we never stopped thinking about the language of opera, and so scenes were developed with, sometimes with the music leading the development of a scene, or other times, developing the music and the action sort of in tandem, and sometimes the object would lead, and Jonathan would write around it, but it was never really composed in the sense of film music. It was never. I mean, the music was developed as the piece was being written, and so, beyond that, I think that Jonathan has a couple of habits which I think are very interesting. One of them, I think, is that, in terms of your question, has to do with the way he uses music spatially. He places music or musicians in space, as a way of composing, and he in that way is really connected to choreography and movement, and so it's sort of easy for us to meet in that place, and and beyond that, he does it, in the way that he mixes sound and music in the final mix of the film, so that when you're, not in this setting, but in a proper screening, you'll have these discrete sound channels around the room where instruments are placed, in the back of the hall, rather than in the left, right, and center speakers in the front of the space. So he has a very unusual relationship to space that way, I think, for a composer. And the other is a little more perverse. I think it's about refusing to allow the music to deliver a kind of direct, sentimental, or emotional payoff that you're used to having in cinema. And he's, I think he has a disdain for that, and he really exercises it in these pieces, which I think is helpful. And I think that kind of, it helps create these shifts that I'm also interested in visually, in creating tension between images that don't necessarily belong together, but by placing them in proximity, something else can happen along the lines of this subliming vessel concept. I think that's also true in the image making, and I think it's very true for Jonathan as well, musically.
And somehow we almost get a sculptural sense of music now. Music having both volume in both senses, and also having a certain spatial grounding. And I suppose then you work with Jonathan in that in-between relational space that you talked about right at the start of our conversation. And this then leads me to my final question, which also I think emerged in the film. There is a kind of lineage of male or masculinist authority in the citations of the work. There's Norman Mailer, there's Whitman, and then there's Norman Mailer, and then there's Hemingway, and Norman Mailer's competitiveness with Hemingway is who's going to be the great American writer, and then the Osiris myth, and the pharaonic myths, etc. So there's a kind of line of male authority as a spine, but at each point you void that authority. You bleed it out in ways. You complicate it. These are haunted sovereigns, if you like. They're sovereigns haunted continually either by a sense of their own obsolescence, even when they're most puissant, like the anxiety of Mailer was always to think that he was up front and on top, and then feel deeply internally anxious. So you pick up the anxiety of male authority. And as my friend Helen put it in a conversation we had this morning, maybe you're queering that authority the whole time too, because in the tension you show between that authority and its anxiety, you open up another erotic space, a space of sexual transgression, inversion. Of course, you're interested in the kind of anal birth idea, which you even talked about yesterday at the Hammond Museum. But it's more than an inversion. It's a continual transgression, a continual attempt to rethink the place of sexuality, the place of desire, the place of the representations of sexuality and desire, the languages, the images, whether it's through with body or whether it's through with identity or power or pleasure or what is animate or inanimate, what is living or dead. And I just wondered whether you might say something about this thread, or this Ariadne's thread, of sexuality and the continually changing concepts of desire and pleasure and pain and violence.
Well, you've said a lot.
I apologize.
Okay. One thing it makes me think about, I haven't thought about this in a long time, but I can remember sort of as a student making objects and making something and realizing that thing was not going to stand on its own. It was tipping over, and placing a kind of a wedge or a shim underneath it and feeling very satisfied with the presence of that wedge under the object, and thinking about this thing about this stance that we were taught. I was a quarterback, and that we were taught to place one foot straight and the other foot just slightly off, and it lowered one hip, as you put your hands under the center, and it gave you the potential to move 3 different ways, basically. This position with your legs, and I guess it was around the time that I was starting to learn something about art history and contrapposto and like the the way that it shifted the symmetry of the body and just what that meant. And to me, it kind of always meant neither the authority of that sort of beautiful body or its potential to fall, but both. And I think that has sort of stayed with me, that I kind of want it both ways. You know, I want I want to see it fail, and I kind of want it to stand. And so the wedge is still there, really. It's in this show a lot. And but I think that there's something in that, in terms of the way, you know, masculinity is used consistently, you know, not just in terms of my own body and my own relationship to my maleness, but in the way it's used narratively and or as kind of ghosts in the story, but that the real body of the work is more porous and it's more abstract, and that sort of notion of the guest in a host body is sort of really more what the piece is made of. You know, it's a formless, the work is formless, and it's borrowing these bodies to stand, and that formlessness is not really gendered, and although I am, so.
I think that's a remarkable insight, and that's why your work always keeps us off balance in the most productive way, because the axis of the vertical and the horizontal has such a profound, iconic, and historical significance, and you're always neither the one nor the other, you know, but at that diagonal, in that obliquity, and you take us there to bring us back and send us out again in such imaginative and challenging ways through our eyes and our ears and our, you know, our physical comportment as we walk through your works and we look at them. And I thank you very much for this conversation and your generosity.
Thanks.
Thank you. Take a few questions, but we need the lights to be able to see who wants to ask a question, to be able to see a show of hands. Yes, please, yes. Yes, thank you very much.
Well, I just first of all wanted to thank you for the way you spoke about your work. It I appreciate the directness and, to use your word, literalness in listening to you talk about your work. I feel like often there's a lot of complexity in your work, and often when it's discussed, it has a layer of complexity around it, and it was refreshing to hear you speak about it directly, so thank you. And then my question is actually around, you know, every scene is so rich and dense and packed with so many choices. And obviously, as a filmmaker and as an artist, you're constantly making choices. And I guess I'm just interested in a little bit about how each of those choices gets made. And I know they're pulled from all different sources, but what the process is and how you go about sort of placing each choice into the scene.
Can you give me an example, maybe, or because I think it's different. It's different. You know, there are so many different situations that one has to respond to. You know, and sometimes those choices are made ahead of time, and then sometimes they're really improvised on the spot. Sometimes they're made in a more collective way, or somebody who's kind of key in the kind of collaboration, you know, who's, you know, really speaking the language of the piece, will bring something to the foreground, you know, which which becomes really significant in the work. So it isn't always me. So it depends, I mean, I could probably be specific if you were specific.
I think it's just as a viewer watching it, and especially, not always necessarily being able to watch it from start to finish.
Right.
There's an attempt to understand the symbolism in every single choice.
Mhm.
It's almost like I would love a decoder box
Yeah.
to accompany it.
Mhm.
And so I guess just in thinking about how you arrange those choices as you go through it,
Mhm.
but not necessarily specifically, like I could think about, specific scenes that I saw and what led to the choices in one of those, and I guess that would be interesting to speak to,
Mhm.
one specific, but I think I'm thinking more collectively.
Mhm. Yeah.
Another question, please. Mike.
Thanks to you both. Matthew, if we were to speak about the death, a great death, one death could be the American city. And if we were to kind of remove gender, kind of take a process around sculpture away and talk about the death of a city, and then a city like Detroit, then the rebirth potentially through Walla Walla, or through the wilderness or the great pine trees, that there was this other kind of allegorical subtext that felt very strong in the video work that allowed for the suicide of a Trans Am and its redemption in heaven, which might be a foundry in Walla Walla, let's say. And so I'm curious about how you carry how you carry the city. And if you could maybe share with us the codes of life and death as they might relate to urbanity and the rural or something.
Well, for sure, the starting point for me is usually place. Like, that's where it starts for me. So in this case, spending time in Los Angeles and Detroit and New York was really important to the writing of the piece. But I would say the time I spent in Detroit was the most important, as I think, for starters, it's a city I didn't know as well. And I went there to look at a salt mine, and I had heard that there was a salt mine beneath the city. In fact, there is. You enter in Dearborn in the industrial area, and then you head back underground, back toward the city center, and it's vast down there. But in looking at the salt mine, I started to understand more about the mineral wealth of the city and how that was very important to the development of the manufacturing boom there. That Henry Ford went there because he had everything he needed to make the automobile, all of the minerals, and I guess I had been in a certain way avoiding Detroit because it just sort of felt like such an obvious choice. But by seeing this kind of prehistoric layer in Detroit that you can see in the stockpiles all around Dearborn, next to the dilapidated factories and houses and the things that you know about Detroit and its failure, it really put something into perspective for me in terms of what I wanted out of this piece. I kind of wanted that archaeology or that sort of layering to exist where these different moments in time can be seen simultaneous, and that the failure is just as legible as the kind of grassroots rebirth and the you know, the empire still has some dignity, but its failure is legible. You know, that we can sort of accept all of those things in a non-hierarchical way. That you know, I think that's what I wanted out of the piece, and that's what Detroit gives you. And does that answer your question? Yeah.
Could I just add there that there is also, particularly with the use of the Osiris myth and its various urban locations, there is a kind of notion of rememberment. You know, the whole point of the myth is to bring it back together in some viable way. That's what the soldering of the body, to bring the body back, to give it a kind of wholeness which is not simply homogeneous, not simply sovereign, but where the parts can be brought together. And I've always understood that, certainly in response to the question, as also being part of the urban scapes, or the urban landscapes, or the urban locations. And there's been this hope of bringing back, putting back together again what has been so sundered and so sullied. That's just please. And this is our final question, I'm afraid. Okay. Yeah.
In studying things like alchemy, it's a very important ritual of which by the time you get to, I guess, the bare bones of it, the kind of structure of it, it begins to kind of take its own form within your life. And so I just kind of wanted to know what it did for you when you were doing your pieces on basically alchemy.
Well, I think in terms of the let's say the foundry arts, this piece gave me access to some more traditional ways of working, which you know, although it started in this more archaic way with this large iron pour, it also opened the door to working with the various alloys, you know, to bronze and brass and carbon steel and stainless steel and I think I don't think I would have allowed myself to kind of go down that path, that sort of traditional sculpture making path, had it not been for you know, sort of entering through this more esoteric place, you know, and through the narrative of this ancient Egyptian narrative. So I think that's what I gained out of this more than anything, is really the possibility of making a bronze sculpture, you know, in a very traditional sense, which I feel grateful for, actually. You know, after spending so many years really avoiding these more traditional ways of making and exploring all the synthetics and the hybrids and all of these other materials and processes, to end up in this more traditional way of making has been really satisfying. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
And we say thank you. Okay. Thanks to everybody. Thanks.